Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well, and welcome to tonight's second half. Before we jump into it, a couple quick links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. The merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click the like button. It takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads that I put out daily, click the bell icon. And folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. They definitely do matter, and they are appreciated. And with that, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump into tonight's second half, shall we? First encounter. For years, I had convinced myself that I had come face to face with a real-life werewolf. It wasn't until I recently looked into the subject that I learned it was a species known as the Dogman. My encounter happened in Featherville, Idaho, 1978. I had graduated high school and I had been working as an apprentice for a local carpenter. I was always interested in building stuff, and I knew at a very young age that I wanted to work on constructing homes. As a way of furthering my skills on my own time and terms, my parents allowed me to renovate a guest house that was in the backyard of their new home that they had recently moved into. I hadn't spent too much time there, but it was truly a beautiful property. The thing must have been over 5 acres. On the weekends, I would bring over a 6-pack of beer and get to work while getting a tan at the same time. It wasn't until the 3rd or 4th weekend that I was working on this guest house when I saw the creature that made me question reality itself. Fortunately, I was up on the roof when I first spotted it. I cannot say what attracted it to the area, but when my eyes first landed on this creature, it was walking around the guest house on 2 legs. Honestly, my first reaction was that it was either one of my parents or one of the landscapers. My second thought was that it was someone wearing a quality werewolf mask that wanted to give me a good scare. But I quickly realized that if that were the case, it would have been one of the tallest people I had ever seen in my life. I could tell that even from my perspective on the roof, the height alone was shocking. I didn't even say a thing when I saw it. I just observed, waiting for it to acknowledge me in some way. I assumed it had to be a person because nothing else made sense at the time. It wasn't even until it wandered off that it dawned on me. I may have seen a rare creature. I remember wondering whether it was a Bigfoot that I had seen only feet away from me. Growing up in Idaho, it wasn't at all uncommon to hear rumors about alleged Bigfoot sightings. So given the height of this creature, it crossed my mind. I did not tell my parents about the first sighting. I was still trying to understand what it was that I had seen. They were just so happy about their new home that I did not want to risk worrying them. Although I don't think they would have believed me even if I had tried to tell them about what I had seen. They probably would have thought I'd seen a black bear or a large stray dog or whatever. And the worst case scenario would be that they'd question whether strangers were wandering onto their property. By the time the following weekend had come around, I had pretty much convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I had not told anyone else about it, and I began to doubt the reliability of my memory. Nothing out of the ordinary happened during the next weekend, but it was the weekend after that where things got even weirder. I was in the little kitchen area of this guest home installing a brand new refrigerator when I noticed movement through the nearest window. When I got closer to the window, I saw the hind legs of something that was bent over and focused on something on the ground in front of it. See, the main reason I thought it was a werewolf was, while I was looking at it through the window, I could have sworn I heard it mumbling something to itself. Not anything in English or any language I had heard, but it seemed clear that there was a form to it. I should mention that that was the only time I thought I heard the thing speak, so I suppose I could have been mistaken. I've never seen any reports where a dogman allegedly spoke, but given how many reports there are that involve Sasquatch, is that far-fetched idea? I remember how I walked over to the door and locked it before I strolled back over to the window. The creature was still present, so I banged on the wall, hoping to startle it, so that it would run back to wherever it had come from. Surprised, it leapt backward a few feet, and that's when it locked eyes with me. There was something so sinister about the way it looked at me. I'm convinced that I saw legitimate anger in its eyes. I got so freaked out when it locked eyes with me that I walked into the bedroom and closed the curtains and waited there for I don't know how long. I wanted to call my parents to warn them not to walk over to the guest house, but the telephone line had not yet been set up. I kind of just stood there trying to gather my thoughts while listening for any sign of the creature still being near. I can't say why I had such a worse feeling compared to the first time I had seen this creature, but I guess it was something to do with looking into its eyes. I'm not a very religious person or anything, but when I was looking at it, I got this terrible feeling, like I was looking into the eyes of a demon or something. This thing had no positive energy at all. That I can say for sure. Eventually, I was startled by a knock at the front door and the jiggling of the doorknob, and of course, I wondered whether the creature was trying to make its way inside. And it was creepy as hell to think that it may know how to use a doorknob. It wasn't long before that I heard my dad's voice. He was calling out, asking why I had locked the door, as well as if I wanted an afternoon snack. Worried that he could be out there with the creature, I rushed over to the door and pulled him inside, and once again locked the door behind me. My dad looked disturbed, and the very first thing he asked was whether I was on dope or not. He said that I had looked all sweaty, like I had been up all night partying or something. After I assured him that was not the case, I told him about the creature outside. That was when he revealed to me that he had also seen something that he could not identify. He said he saw it climb up into a tree. It was the noise that directed his attention to something that he thought was a hairy human heading up into the tops of the pines. Of course, he said that in a way that insinuated that he had been mistaken. To him, his eyes had been playing tricks on him, and he thought that it was an oversized bobcat or something similar. Whatever he thought it was, he wasn't the least bit concerned. I thought he was taking it too lightly. My dad was a strong, confident guy, but I was worried that this was a circumstance where his confidence may get him and my mom injured if not killed. When I saw the dogman looking at me, there was no question that it could tear all three of us limb from limb. At the time, I could not believe that these things were walking around in people's backyards, yet nobody is warning anyone about them. The thought of that angered me. As crazy as it sounds, I yearned for a productive way to warn the whole community of what lurks out there. I wanted to explain to people that they should never allow their kids to roam around in or near woods without close supervision. And even then, it is still incredibly risky. My dad eventually convinced me that the coast was clear, so I walked back with him to the main house. That short stroll felt so much longer than it really was. I kept thinking that that creature was going to charge out of the woods at any given time. When we made it inside, my mom quickly asked what was wrong. My dad jumped in, explaining to her that I must have glimpsed the oversized bobcat and had mistaken it for something else. His tone implied that he did not want to worry my mom. I couldn't blame him for that, yet I also felt a nagging responsibility to be honest so that she could keep her eyes peeled while walking the property. Because of the timing, it felt like such a predicament. Obviously, I didn't want my parents to regret purchasing the property, but I also didn't want them to get mauled by this freakish-looking creature. Ultimately deciding that it was best to remain composed and show minimal signs of fear, I did all I could do to proceed as normal with the renovations. I was pleasantly surprised that my desire to complete the project ended up overpowering my feelings of fear. The weeks carried on as normal, and I began to wonder if the creature had maybe migrated to another area. Enough time had passed that I even began to question whether I'd experienced delusions, and that just maybe my dad was correct to say my perception was not accurate. Fortunately, I had finished the renovation without complication, and I was delighted by how much it seemed to satisfy my mom and dad. They looked forward to providing future guests with a charming and comfortable place to sleep. Soon, my speculation about that strange creature would settle. It was a weekend that I was over at my parents' house for an early evening barbecue. One of their neighbors, Carol, was over. Mom and Dad learned that she had recently lost her husband, and they were trying to show her some support and distract her from the sorrow. I distinctly remember Carol saying, "What is that?" Well, she stared out the window. The tone in her voice made it obvious that there was something bizarre that caught her attention. When I turned my attention out the window, that was when all suspicion that I may have been imagining this creature was squashed. There it was, pacing back and forth on 2 feet, sniffing the air. Right away, I could tell that it had been drawn by the smell of food that was grilling. Luckily, it had been one of those rainy days causing us to socialize inside whenever the cooking meat didn't need attention. All 4 of us were inside when this Dogman appeared. When it proceeded toward the location of the grill, I was shocked when my dad began heading toward the door to shoo it off. I had to stand in front of the door and convince him to sit down. He was worried that the meat was going to burn if someone did not remove it from the grill. That was the least of my worries at the time. All I could think about was that Dogman was going to attempt to make its way inside after realizing the grill was too hot to remove the food. Of course. That was when I assumed that the creature's intelligence was akin to that of an average wolf. It sent chills up my spine as the 4 of us stared out the window and watched the creature use one of its large hands to grip the handle and flip the grill lid open. Its body language conveyed that it had previously dealt with this kind of contraption, possibly on several occasions. And furthermore, it didn't even attempt to remove the meat with its hands. Even though the tongs were resting on the plate beside the grill, it walked over and seemed to grab a stick from the nearby ground, nudging the meat off of the grill. After most of the meat had fallen off of the grill and onto the concrete, the creature got down onto all 4s and consumed it savagely. It was at that moment that I felt like I was watching a homeless man with a dog's head eat its first meal of the month. My brain had so much trouble deciding whether I was looking at something that was more man or more animal. As I looked into my dad's eyes, I could tell that he was ready to forfeit any beliefs that we were dealing with something even remotely normal. In fact, he even apologized to me for implying that I was overreacting. As we continued to watch this creature feed, Carol brought up how she had heard the oddest noises outside of her bedroom window plenty of times. Her deceased husband, George, had grown to believe that there was some kind of extraterrestrial activity, because they both agreed they could hear a dialogue, but it sounded completely foreign to them. Every time George went to peek out the window, he never had luck spotting anything. Though she never said outright, it seemed Carol thought this Dogman was of extraterrestrial origin. And I cannot lie. I sometimes wonder if that would be the case. It's just so suspicious to me that these creatures can exist, yet They are not officially documented by science. Like, what the hell could be the reason for that? The theory that I find most believable is these creatures like Dogman and Sasquatch led to other, even more disturbing truths that the government has deemed far too disruptive for society to learn. It makes you think about who or what is watching us from the shadows at all times, all while we are usually without the slightest clue. As you likely expected, the Dogman was efficient at devouring the meat, and once it was finished, it ran on all fours around the house and out of sight. That was the first time I had seen it move on all fours. Up until that point, I assumed it walked upright at all times. I guess they are similar to Sasquatch species, where they are efficient at both stances. When we eventually went outside later that evening to switch the grill off, my dad had noticed quite a few drops of blood around the area of the grill. Normally, we would have ruled that blood coming from the meat. However, it was too well done at the time that creature had slipped it off the grill. Neither my parents nor I ever saw the Dogman again after that, but we did end up moving down to Arizona about a year later. Since we never saw the Dogman again, we often speculated if the blood could have been a sign that the rare creature was badly wounded. If it was the case, had it been injured by gunfire or maybe a violent encounter with another one of its kind, or even possibly a Sasquatch? I guess some things will remain a secret forever. I encourage you to have someone else with you when you venture out into nature, or at the very least, carry a sturdy weapon to defend yourself. Thank you. So, the way he described the creature and how Carol, the neighbor, had believed, her and her husband had believed that possibly the Dogman was of extraterrestrial origin, that could honestly be 100% true. Ancient Sumerians believed that there was a dog-headed race of alien, and they were apparently pretty violent. But I remember when I had my experience in 1994, the only Dogman experience I ever had, that really put me on the track that I am now of researching and learning as much as I can about these creatures and more, was that when we came to that stop sign and we all looked, we didn't notice it right away. The thing is we had seen eyeshine. My friend Gabe had seen two walking quadruped. We had not seen these creatures yet. But when we hit the stop sign, I looked to see if there were any cars coming. So I looked that way, and immediately standing right by the stop sign was this creature that we saw. And there were multiple of this same creature in the woods. We didn't see visibly their bodies. We saw their eye shine and heard them running through the woods towards us. The only one that we saw was that one there. But I remember looking at it and thinking, and I didn't say it out loud, but I remember thinking that this creature did not belong on Earth. There was something so strange about the way its legs were. And I don't recall, because it was such a long time ago. I don't recall if it was because it had hocked legs, because I don't believe it did. I don't recall it having a tail. It looked very similar to the Egyptian depiction of Anubis. It had this not super long German Shepherd or wolf-like muzzle. It was shorter and more rounded, but its ears were just so huge and like right up. And their eyes were this glowing white. And I remember thinking it didn't belong on Earth. And how did it get from where we were to here before we did, when the woods that it would have to run through was just full of debris and brush and overgrowth. Because where I had my experience was in a cul-de-sac of newly built homes at different stages of being built. But when they cleared this cul-de-sac out, they put a lot of debris into the tree line to get rid of it, stuff that they didn't obviously take away in a dump truck or whatnot. But, so there was just a lot of crap out there. I remember there being like a pile of macadam, like extra macadam that for some reason someone had dumped right like close to or inside the tree line, like maybe a couple feet. You could visibly see it in the daytime when me and my friend Martin went back the next day to look for tracks. But it just didn't seem like it belonged on this planet, And as for vocalization, per Victor, the werewolf-like creature was the one that could vocalize. And there are people still that I get every once in a while in the comment section, what's the difference between a dogman and a werewolf? Well, I did a short on the difference. And per Victor, according to Victor, and he was a government cryptid hunter that worked for an alphabet agency, not former, he was a Marine at one time and then was drafted into this agency. But he said that these werewolf creatures could vocalize. And the difference between a dogman and a werewolf, key things. Dogman has hawked legs, a brushy, puffy tail, long tail, or skinny and long. Very narrow, kind of wolf-like snout. And the werewolf stands more like a man. Almost imagine a Sasquatch with a shorter kind of small muzzle. Regular kind of human, almost human-like feet. No tail. And able to vocalize, stronger than a dogman and more intelligent than a dogman. Dogman being more aggressive, though. So that was the difference between the two. And I do recall, actually, there being an experience that I had narrated, a year into me starting this story, or channel, and this woman's story was, she had parked in her driveway, and I've looked for it in all of my files and I cannot find it anywhere. But this woman had her two kids in the car, one obviously being much younger than the other, and she pulls into her driveway. Now, her home, where her car was, she would have to go out of her car and onto her sidewalk and kind of up a little hill onto some stairs. So I just hit pause really quick because I thought I remembered where it was, but it's been like 5 years since I've narrated this. But so she'd have to go up her sidewalk, up a set of stairs, a hill and a set of stairs. Her driveway was kind of, it had that kind of retaining wall. And she had her baby in her hand, and her eldest child was in the car. And what she was going to do was she was going to unlock the door. The other child was sleeping. She was going to unlock the door and put the baby in like its pack and play or bassinet, which would be right in the living room, right there, and run back out and get the other child and the groceries, a couple bags of groceries. When she had her baby, she heard a voice say something, like a real verbal cue, like turn around or something like that. And when she did, and it was not, any kind of psychosis or whatever you want to call it. It was an actual physical verbal cue, turn around. And she did, and that's when she saw these red eyes out in the road, closer to the road in the edge of her property. So the car is here and she can see it. And she is just overcome with terror because her door is locked. She's got a baby in her arms, and her other baby or child is in this car, locked. And she made the split decision to quickly unlock the door, open the door. She keeping her eyes on the creature, get to her car, get her other child, and run as fast as she could to her home. And when her husband came home, the car door was open, the groceries were still in the car, and she was in a panic, but she was okay, and her kids were okay. But the scariest part of that whole experience, one, being a parent, your kids, but to hear something vocalize, physically give you a vocal command, like turn around, and it's right there. And like I said, she is adamant, or was adamant, about it not being in her head, that it was, she heard it with her ears. So, but that's the difference between Dogman, werewolf, and vocalizations of them, what I've heard through the times researching and this channel and getting to meet different people here and there. So let's jump into today's next encounter. Experience happened in the location the same location where the alleged Honey Island swamp monster has been spotted. In 2014, a good friend of mine and local swamp rat, Ned, had told me about an unusual find he had run across earlier in the day, in the form of some dead hog. The two of us were at a boat ramp having this conversation, and he offered to run me back over to where they were to have a look for myself. So I had jumped back into his boat and headed to where he had found them. Now, Honey Island Swamp covers about 135 square miles in Slidell, and a fair amount of the locals use it as a resource for food and to make a few bucks. Ned brought us straight away to the area where he nosed the boat onto the shore, and after only a few steps, there they were. There were two wild hogs split open up the middle with their organs missing, and the rest of their bodies were completely intact and unmolested. They were not a day old, if that, with the mere fact that no gators or anything else had taken them being a bit odd. Their undersides were splayed open with what appeared to be ripped rather than cut by a knife's blade. About 30 feet away, where we stood, was an old elevated tree stand that hadn't been used in many years. Ned said to me, "Come over here and have a look at these tracks." Only a few steps away from where the hog lay, the ground was very damp with no grass on it. I only mention this because the hogs' bodies were laying in some very thick, matted swamp grass. We were now looking down at many tracks, both coming toward the hog and leading away from them. They looked like gigantic alligator had laid them down, but they were enormous and all the same shape. An alligator's front and rear feet are slightly different, and their body also leaves the evidential trace or slide on the ground as they move, which was not present here. These were huge tracks with 3 toes and what appeared to be a prong or claw at the rear that made a distinct hole in the rear of each print as whatever was walked back and forth. Neither of us had ever heard or knew of anything that just ate the organ meat and left the carcass behind. And I am here to tell you that with all the gators here, it was a miracle in of that itself that these two hogs were left untouched on the bank close to the water for many hours. I didn't even think about what Ned told me back over, but there they were. Both hogs' necks were broken, and there was what appeared to be several puncture marks along their upper back, as though claws had squeezed into them while they were grasped. Ned asked me what I thought of the whole thing, and I told him maybe a rougarou or the Honey Island swamp monster. We walked over to the tree stand, and it was perfectly intact, only being somewhat overgrown from years of not being used. There were many blinds in here that old-timers used, and having died, they had left their stands. Over the next couple of weeks, Ned and I had kicked around the idea of trying to bait whatever it was there. And so it was that we shot up about 6 nutria and quartered a hog to use as bait. We went back to the stand on a Tuesday evening, and having cleared it all out of debris, we strung all of the bait on rope around the stand, hanging all the pieces about 6 to 8 feet from the ground. In this way, not even a big gator would pull them down. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the swamp came alive with the noise as we sat in that stand and waited. It was about midnight that we heard what sounded like a distant roar. Neither of us could identify. About an hour later, we heard a scream which sounded like a woman in a horror movie erupt from the forest off to our north. Then everything went silent. It was like someone had turned a switch off. Not even the frogs were croaking. On a couple occasions, we had signaled each other after hearing what sounded like movement, but we dared not turn the flashlights on and scare off whatever was there. I had thought that I had seen a dark mass a couple of times, but with the woods being so dark itself, it was virtually impossible to discern what was there. At around 4 a.m, the woods began to come alive with noise again, and before we knew it, the sun was rising in the east. Ned was the first to notice that the hanging hog was gone, and what we had hung had no organs in it whatsoever. All the nutrias were still hanging from the ropes as we had left them. Climbing down from the stand, and now standing where the hog had been hanging, the very same strange footprints were present on the ground below where the hog had hung. And the entire hog and rope were gone, apparently having been untied from the limb. If it had been the same creature that we had heard screaming and howling, it also had the ability to untie a knot as well. We left the swamp that morning, shaking our heads, and left it at that. I knew you would be interested, so that was my experience. I just thought I would let it be known that these creatures are out there. And it's very strange that the hogs had been left untouched while laying close to the water's edge for that many hours. That's the weirdest part. A gator will sniff out a small piece of chicken hanging from a limb and come to eat it rather quickly. And yet, here were 2 hogs lying gutted in gator's home turf, but they hadn't been eaten or so much as nibbled on. Your guess is as good as mine. So, I don't know, Dogman, rougarou. Interestingly enough, and I've often thought about this, and I'm sure many of you have too, but it's just another puzzle piece, a missing puzzle piece on why. We've all heard about a carcass of a deer being found or something. Dogman killed a deer. Someone witnessed it, right? And left its body. And yet no other animal, including birds of prey or vultures or whatever, would touch it. Why is that? It's such a strange thing to think about. Maybe the pheromones or hormones or whatever musk from that creature was left on the body so it wouldn't be touched. Uh, your guess is as good as mine on that. I mean, it's theory, you know? So anyway, it's just a weird one, right? It's third encounter. The fall of 2018, my buddy Tim and I were going into the LBL for a deer hunt. Tim had headed down from Michigan for the week, and I had gone into the woods the day before his arrival to set up our tree stands. It was October. I had just set Tim's stand on the ridge above the bottom land where I would be, in an area named Wildcat Hollow. The two of us would be about 300 yards apart during the hunt, and being as we were so close to civilization, we still had cell service, which would allow us to text message each other during the hunt. This locale was only a mile from the Tennessee River, which in these parts turns into the Kentucky Lake, a dam being built many years ago. Tim had arrived late in the day following my setting the stands up for the two of us, and the following morning we were in place some 300 yards apart an hour before sunrise. The leaves had just begun to fall, most still clinging to the branches as we sat, watched, and listened for any activity. That is when we heard the first tree come crashing down. I heard a loud crack followed by some whooshing noise of a tree falling through the canopy surrounding it. Tim texted me almost immediately asking if I had just heard that, which I did in fact. It had happened virtually in between our two positions, which at the time I did not give much thought to. Only a short time after this, the second tree came crashing to the ground. This time, it was like a free fall with none of the whooshing sound, only that of a tree hitting the earth with a loud thud. Now, you know, much of the time I spend in the woods hunting since my youth, and in all of that time I can only remember hearing one tree fall while in the short time. We had heard two, and it was not over. Just a short time later, I heard what sounded like a tree being pushed back and forth with numerous cracking and snapping sounds to go along with it, followed by the inevitable crash to the earth. By 8:30 in the morning, the trees falling had ceased, and we had seen 0 deer in the woods. Tim and I had texted each other to meet in the middle, so to speak, and find the tree that had come down closer to our positions. I found the tree. It was about 20 inches in diameter, appearing to be in excellent condition with the leaves still on it, having been snapped and splintered at about the 6-foot level from the ground, showing no internal insect or rot damage, as well as no lightning strike evidence having happened in the past. It was a healthy, large tree. As the two of us just stood there looking at it, Tim asked me what I thought had happened, and I breached the subject of a Bigfoot possibly being the culprit. He would have none of that, after which I argued what would have the power to snap a tree at that height from the ground without being able to leverage it from a higher level. So I commenced to shimmy up a narrower tree to the point where my weight started to bend it over, at which point it snapped and splintered virtually at the same height and in the same way this larger tree had. Tim just stood there with shock in his head, saying nothing. He did comment on how still and quiet the forest had been in the morning, a fact that supported something was around that other than wildlife. The following morning, I had put an arrow through a nice doe and texted Tim that I had done so. After waiting 20 minutes, I climbed out of the stand and began my track. There was apparent blood in tracks, easy for someone of my skill set to follow, which brought me to the edge of the creek. The creek is only ankle deep, and having walked through it to the other edge, the tracks and blood had ended on the first side. The deer having not crossed the creek, was gone. Whatever had happened to it had occurred next to a stream, a spot that could only be seen when you're walking into it. 3 days later, Tim had texted me BBD, which in our terminology meant big buck down. He had run an arrow in one side of his buck and out the other side as it bolted into the hollow, heading away from his position. Blood came out both sides of the animal as we began our track, which continued unbelievably for several hours, ending where the tracks and blood stopped, going up the opposite side of the hollow. And the buck was nowhere to be found, just as my doe had vanished by the creek. So Tim's buck had disappeared also with no trace. Here is the real kicker. If what I had said so far is insufficient, weeks before the hunt in LBL, I had read about a game warden who had a ranch not 10 miles from where we stood, who hired a man with a backhoe to dig something up on his property. I don't remember if it was a cesspool, drain pipe, or whatever. The man was being pelted with rocks while he worked on the property, so he called the warden, thinking he was screwing with him. As they said, the warden said he was on the other side of the lake, far away from his house, and the man having arrived back from the farm, the warden now standing and talking with a machine operator, experiences rocks thrown at him and the operator. At the same time, his daughter, standing on the porch, said, "Daddy, what is that?" When the men turned around to where she was pointing, 3 huge creatures were standing on the side of the field, fully visible to all parties in present. My conclusion regarding this matter is that there seems to be a population of Bigfoot and more in the surrounding area, as crazy as that may seem to some, performing various activities regarding human interaction. Today's 4th experience brings us back to the Honey Island. At this time in my life, I was a co-leader of a boys' club in my community. There were quite a few young men whose fathers had flown the coop, or whose moms had had them out of wedlock in our surrounding area. And we provided a venue for the young men to get together with some big brother or fatherly figures. The boys were very appreciative of what we were doing, and on many occasions we planned some type of outing for the day, which on this particular day happened to be running around the swamp in some John boats. There was hardly a house in the area at the time that didn't have, at the very least, one of these little tin boats. And we had brought 4 of them with the boys via pickup trucks and vans down by the swamp to launch. We had 1 12-footer and 3 14-footers at our disposal, all of which were fairly lightweight, being made of aluminum, and they were easy to slide in and out of the pickup's truck bed. Upon arriving at the launch site, myself and 2 other young men, with the assistance of the boys, slid the boats into the water in preparation for the activities. Now, just to set the stage for you, this place was on the extreme edge of what you would call rural. Most of the houses in the area would be called shacks by the majority of Americans, with very few inhabitants living in the surrounding area. Simply put, it meant that if you got in trouble around these parts, you were indeed in trouble with no help available. We weren't going far, and the boats were equipped with an electric motor and car batteries, with oars as a backup if need be. Our plan was to do an exploratory stint for a few hours to check out some of the critters in the swamp, and believe me, there are more than a few critters there. Some of them could do you in if you were not careful. For the first 45 minutes or so, the young men were a little rambunctious, but then things started to calm down a bit. We were slowly meandering around, pointing out a variety of birds and such, with the men and boys in the boats discussing what we were seeing, when we decided to take a slight detour into the trees and more flooded areas of the swamp. We were negotiating the trees and passages through the flooded woods when one of the boys said, "What is that over there?" There were many things in here which swim in the water, including gators, but this was no alligator. As far as I was concerned, we were all well focused on it, and to me it appeared to be the head and shoulders moving through the water, but of what I had no idea. I had seen everything that a swamp had to offer as far as aquatic creatures went, but I had never seen anything the likes of what we were looking at. I was thinking for a moment that its head and shoulders were perhaps that of a large deer, but that was passing through. I'd say this because it really didn't remind me of anything, but my mind couldn't accept what I was seeing. It seemed to be the upper body of something enormous that was actually walking in the water up to its shoulders. We could see no hands or arms if there were. They were submerged, as whatever this was seemed to be walking up to its neck in the water. The more I focused on it, the more I was convinced it was an enormous pair of shoulder muscles tapered up to about ear level on its head. No sooner had that thought registered than did the notion of this thing being the Honey Island swamp monster came to mind. Everything that I've just told you took place in maybe 30 seconds when suddenly this thing was coming out of the water as it was entering shallow area, heading into the cypress. Within 10 seconds, it had taken possibly 3 strides and was fully exposed. Walking away into the trees, everyone was dead silent as we watched this massive monster walk away. Turning its head slightly, it looked our way without missing a step and then quite literally disappeared into the trees of hanging moss. I saw it come in and out of view maybe 4 or 5 times as it did so, and then it was gone. Our jaws were agape as we looked at each other and then back into the direction we had just seen this thing. Then we began to talk. All who had heard of this monster were in full agreement that what we had seen was the Honey Island monster, and as for those in the group who hadn't, well, they are now believers, as the rest of us were. At the moment when we had the first seen it, the group was exceptionally quiet, and with the electric motors humming along, we were actually moving at a pretty good clip through the calm waters. We'd obviously caught this thing unaware as it was navigating a deep throw to get to where it was going. I don't believe that it would have trapped itself in deep water had it seen us beforehand. When it emerged from the water, it was covered in soaking wet long hair that clung to its form, its huge muscle-bound body. The monster was all but 7 feet tall and was able to cover ground very quickly and quietly as it slipped into the trees and out of sight. And there you have it, folks. I do hope you all enjoyed today's second half as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you all for supporting the channel. It is, after all, your support that helps the channel to continue to grow and go, and honestly what gives us all a place and a chance to share our experiences and theories judgment-free. Everyone is simply treated with the respect that we deserve. Please, everyone, stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and our friends. These creatures are real, they are out there and dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless you all.